Before we look into executing our task, looking at creating a charter for a cyber risk committee, and of course, the very important thing is to understand what are we referring to when we speak of charter. And of course, a charter has a particular structure. But before we look at the structure, we need to understand what do we actually mean by charter. Now, according to the XLP Industrial Trust Audit and Cyber Risk Committee Charter. A charter is a formal document defining the structure, the roles, the responsibilities, and meeting requirements of that particular committee. It delegates board authority for overseeing cyber risk and internal controls while defining the scope of the committee's oversight role. So that's very important for you to understand when it comes on to charter. So a typical charter in terms of the structure is made up of you have your purpose of the charter, the scope, the authority, the committee structure, roles and responsibilities, your meeting cadence, you have your risk decision framework, the risk acceptance criteria, you have your escalation protocol, the reporting requirements, and last, review and continuous improvement. So that's the overall structure in terms of the important elements that need to form that particular charter that you're trying to establish for your organization. So with that said, the first step is to establish the objectives of the committee in terms of defining why the committee exists. That's very important in terms of building out your charter. And of course, I'll be providing you with this template outline that you can use to guide you in that particular process if you're tasked with such. So let me maximize this as well for clarity. So first thing is to establish the objective of the committee in terms of your why the committee exists. So you provide oversight of cyber risk posture. You align cyber risk with business objectives to ensure risk-informed decision making, and this acts as approval authority for example, your risk acceptance, the exception, the major remediation investments in the organization. So the Cyber Risk Committee provides governance oversight for enterprise cyber risk, ensuring alignment with business objectives and defined risk appetite in the organization. So this actually gets to the point of aligning to business context, which has to do with phase one, which is thinking. So you want to be linking your cyber risk to all the necessary things within the organization. So as it relates to these important elements, then you want to, for example, define or look at the various role structures that are outlined in the organization. So a charter pretty much consists of the purpose of the charter in terms of the description, your scope, what the charter entails, the authority in terms of the approvers of risk acceptance, escalation, remediation, the overall structure, and your cadence. Then you move on to your RACI, and this is where you define the roles and responsibility of the charter. So here, for example, you establish committee RACI in terms of responsibilities. So for example, here we have the role, the CISO act as the chair of this particular cyber risk charter, who will lead meetings and escalator board. We have the GRC lead, who prepares reports and track risk, your IT security, business owner, legal compliance, internal audit. So these are all the roles that are established within the RACE, the responsible, acceptable, accountable, and the list goes on as part of your RACE matrix. So once that has been established, of course, you would have your risk scoring decision. That is the overall part, and in terms of defining your risk decision framework. And this is where most GRC professionals fail. You must operationalize decision making within your organization. And this is where your risk scoring comes into the picture. In terms of establishing, for example, a standardized scoring model where you establish your likelihood, your impact, your risk score calculations. And once that has been achieved, then you want to move on to establishing your risk threshold. For example, defining your risk ratings, 1 to 5, 6 to 10, and the list goes on. Those are part of your overall charter. Once you have established your risk thresholds, then you go on to your risk decision authority where you have the various levels. Great. And there is a number of principles and rationale when it comes on to building out each of these individual elements. As I've mentioned before, I just want to give you an idea of the things that are involved at each of these levels so that you can actually use this as a springboard to do deeper research to build on your skill set. Great. So decision authority, and the key principle is that the higher the risk, the higher the authority required within the organization. And you move on to establishing, as part of this charter, the escalation triggers. And escalation should not be subjective. You want to declare or define clear triggers in the organization. For example, some of those mandatory triggers could be the risk score. That is where you have critical risk in terms of the condition. For example, in this case, score greater than or equal to 16 has been categorized as critical risk for the organization, regulatory impact to the organization. And in this case, if we look at regulatory impact, for example, GDPR breach, risk to the organization, financial impact greater than 500,000, data exposure, customer data at risk, your control failure, critical system failure. These are the conditions. Audit findings, repeated issues in the organization. So those are some of the escalation triggers as it relates to the risk that the organization faces in any particular time. Next element of your charter involves your decision SLA in terms of how fast and how decisions are made based on your service level agreements. So if the risk falls, whatever risk you're addressing falls at, for example, medium, then a decision time frame is over 10 days. If it is high, then it is within 5 days. It is a critical risk level, then it is a decision that has to be made within 24 to 48 hours. So it's very, very important to have your charter, your security charter established as part of your overall GRC or security program for these things to be in place, and also to form your overall playbook within an organization as part of being proactive in dealing with various security incidents within an organization. Secondly, as part of this process as well, you want to look at defining risk acceptance in the organization. So this is where you define what acceptable risk means. And the risk can only be accepted if cost mitigation is greater than risk impact, your temporary acceptance, which remediation plan, compensating controls exist within risk appetite. So these are the only factors that determine whether or not risk can be acceptable. So as part of your risk acceptance criteria, you look at cost versus benefit. You look at temporary, you look at compensating controls, you look at whether or not they're within appetite. And of course, you define your mandatory documentation where every risk acceptance must include, for example, your risk description, the score. So if we look at our risk register, the mandatory documentation, the necessary defining or reporting and oversight. These are the various components that are part of this overall process. In terms of your metrics, top risks, your descriptions, these are the things that you want to have as part of your risk or your charter. So at a high level, the most important thing to bear in mind when it comes down to developing your charter is ensure that there's a purpose. You understand what a charter is. The authority, your committee structure, your roles and responsibilities are outlined. The meeting, your risk decision framework. How do you escalate risk in the organization? How do you establish risk acceptance, the escalation protocol, reporting requirements, review and continuous improvement for that organization? That, in a nutshell, is what your risk charter is all about. So all cyber risk exceeding defined risk appetite thresholds shall be escalated to your cyber risk committee for formal review and decision. So your risk charter plays a very important role as part of your GRC function within the organization. As it relates to creating that charter, that's the overall outline that you need to understand when it comes down to creating the charter for a risk committee and defining those decision thresholds for risk acceptance and escalation in an organization.